Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Matters That Matter. I'm Simran and I'm in conversation with my mentor, Suzy Singh. Suzy, we recently learned that you lost your father, and it is unimaginable to think how you must have dealt with such a big loss at such an unprecedented time with all the uncertainty around. You were not able to visit your family and pay your last respects like you would have liked to in normal circumstances. So, we would like to know how you dealt with this loss and the consequent grief and the unexpected nature of how everything unfolded for you.
So, at the outstart, I'd like to say that I'm stepping into this episode with great trepidation because it's like me entering a black hole again. I worked very intensely and actively with the grieving process, but I guess talking about it now will really be the test of how effective my practice has been. So, I guess this was an aspect that, losing one's parent is something that I had been working internally for a fairly long time. I would imagine it, I would think about how I would deal with it, and I was trying to do everything to be prepared for when the time arrived. And yet, life, I think, has a way of checkmating you because even though I'd had those death and dying conversations with my parents in the past, even though we had spoken about a lot of these things openly, and these are very hard to speak about with your parent, but I'd found the courage to do that. And I still didn't expect to be in these very alien circumstances. I never imagined that I would have to say goodbye to my father from a distance. And so it was very tough. I got into that whole experience without realizing that it would be so hard for me. Because when you think that you worked very hard, I've uh, dealt with a lot of people and helped them with their grieving process. I've done a lot of personal practice. I'd imagined this eventuality, and yet it was very difficult when it arrived. So at first, I think I was hit by the shock of it all because it was sudden. He was perfectly well. It was not anticipated, and it happened all too fast. So I think my first response was numbness and going straight into prayer. It was during this time that I realized that for the first 2 days, all I could be was I was completely removed from my human existence, so to say, and I was sitting in this little crucible of shock and prayer. That's all. And I just was between these two states until I started realizing that I was using my prayerfulness to escape my grief and that I needed to work very actively with the grief. And in doing so, I discovered many different ways of working with that grief. I allowed myself to feel the pain, feel the loss. I let the waves of losing him, the disbelief, the not wanting it to happen, the trying to accept the reality to wash over me many times in a day. I would break down and cry like a baby. I would expect that he was going to walk in through the door anytime. I didn't want to avoid difficult conversations, while I know that a lot of people try and avoid the conversation and busy themselves with the things that need to be done. But I chose not to busy myself with those things. I decided that the most important thing for me at that point in time was attending to the grief. Fortunately for me, was it was my brother who was taking all the necessary steps for the final rites because he was in another city. My father was with him. And so I had no choice but to deal with this remotely. I couldn't busy myself with things. And I realized that maybe life was teaching me to be able to work with this in a different way. It broke me that I couldn't be there to support my mother and my brother. it was almost like feeling wrong for not being there. And logic wasn't working. Even though I had my family reassuring me and telling me that there's no way you can get there. But I remember I kept telling myself, this doesn't feel right. It's not right. So in my head, I was making myself wrong for not being there. And I think by the end of day 2 in my active grieving process, I had realized that I had made a contract in my own head, like, an unspoken contract with my father that I would be there to look after mom and I would be there to look after my brother. And I wasn't there. And not fulfilling that contract is what was hurting me so deeply. So it was very important for me to excavate that contract because it was not in my conscious awareness. I didn't know this is how it was. It took a lot of deep inner work to even recognize that this is the reason why I am blaming myself so harshly for not being there. And once I unearthed that and I was able to actively work with it, then it became somewhat easier for me to accept the rational reality. But the fact that we had to do his last rites virtually, the fact that I didn't get to sort of kiss his forehead and touch his feet and say a very, say the last prayers for him, for his safe onward journey. And of course, I did them from a distance. But I think I expected to be there. And
Yes.
not having been there was a reality check for me. And I had to use all the learning and the practice and the empathy that I could garner to really speak to my own mind and say, it's okay, you can do all of these things from a distance also. And I was very fortunate because my brother was actually doing everything in his power. Those were the lockdown had just begun. It was very hard, but he was honoring all of those last rituals that were important. So there was comfort about that fact, but deep discomfort about not being there for him and mom. And it was in those days that I realized why people talk about, how our ancestors speak about the Chotha and the Termi, these very critical days, because until it is said that for 72 hours, the spirit is still in the vicinity of the loved ones. And so it becomes very important to work to allow that spirit or that divine soul to move back into the light. I was acutely aware of this. And so the other thing that I had to engage in, which was really hard for me, was what I call disentangling and freeing the soul. Regardless of which relationship we are in, I think there are always some hidden unfinished business that you have with that soul. They may have been childhood grouses, or there may have been some grudges that you've held, or some mistakes and errors that you've made, and you've not completed that unfinished business. And that was in fact the very first thing that I did, because I realized that this being has moved into the divine light. And if I don't free up all these strings of attachment, because all of these are attachments, right? Love and hate, love and disagreement, unfinished business, these are all attachments. So we have to let go and cut or sever these attachments. And so I actively chose to seek forgiveness and to forgive, to complete all of those things which I traveled back into along my timeline, my memory timeline. And I visited each of those first conflicting memories, because those are the ones that are usually not dealt with. I brought completion to each one of those, loving completion to each one of those. And by day 4, when I had completed that and I really felt that I had allowed the movement of the soul onwards, that is when I went into the second phase of the more joyful memories. And when I visited those memories, I was able to I felt another huge second layer of loss arriving. Because you want to treasure something that's joyful. You want it there forever and ever and ever. And suddenly you realize that no, this part also you need to let go of. And I chose to anchor my memory in the last loving engagement, which was just 24 hours before when he had called. And he had such a joyful note to his voice. I anchored my memory in that last joyful conversation and dealt with the grief of loss by visiting all those wonderful memories in the past. And then arrived a third very difficult wave a day later because my daughter and I were sitting late into the night. The children were not, they were in their own way struggling with dealing with the loss of their Nanaji passing away. And she came and spoke to me and she broke down. And we sat up 3 in the morning, I remember. And because he was in another city, because he was that last night he was here, he was in the hospital with just a minor blip. It wasn't anything major, or it didn't seem to be anything major. And so it seemed so unexpected and sudden. And we needed to make sense of it all. And she asked me those very difficult questions about what happened, and maybe I was avoiding them. And I was, until that point in time, fairly peaceful with my processes. But then she opened something up in me, and I realized this was where I needed to connect the dots and make sense about the passing. The mind needs to make sense of things. And we needed to speak to the doctors and we needed to find out what actually happened and what was the final cause of his passing away. And that was the hardest part, I think. That was really hard because I found myself sitting up night after night, going through the what if scenarios. What if I could have been there? What would he have been feeling in those moments? Could I have was he in pain? Could I have made the pain a little better? Uh, could he have done something differently? Should we have just kept him at home and not taken him to the hospital? All of those what if questions, because we don't want to accept what
Yes.
has happened.
Yes.
This is part of, I think, some bargaining and denial and some thinking that we can be larger than life, or we could have negotiated with God about the timing and pushed it back or whatever else. That really hurt. I went back to being a complete mess all over again. I think it takes a lot of understanding on the part of the immediate family because I was in a different zone for all of those days, for those first 13 days. I was not engaging with the family at all. I was in my own world. And I'm very lucky because they all appreciate my process. They've seen me work through emotions very intensely in the past. And so they're very respectful of allowing me the space to do the work. But if I didn't have their support, it could have been much, much harder. And I know that for a lot of people, it becomes really difficult because they have their families to attend to and they have, the kids in the household and everything else. But here, my daughter just took charge of running the household and I was left to deal with things. Did I escape my feelings? Yes, I did. There were many times because my children pointed it out to me. My son came and asked my daughter, and he said, "What's with mom? She's gone into this OCD for cleaning." And that's a fact. When the pain becomes too much, I clean and clean and clean and clean the household, hoping to scrub the pain off my insides. So my avoidance, which I would then become aware of when I heard these whispers around me, was the first was the prayers or wanting to just escape into prayers. The second was just cleaning everything around me so hard that when I finally went to sleep at night, my body was aching with pain. And I think I was using that physical pain to dull out the pain in the heart. And when I realized this is what I'm doing, I stopped it. So becoming aware of how you're escaping your pain was a really important part for me. And that helped me drag my attention back to, no, Suzy, you can't keep running away from this. You need to deal with it.
Thank you so much for so candidly telling us about your experience. I know it can be really hard, but I would like to ask you something. You mentioned that there was also a phase where you went into self blame about not having any control over the situation. You went into this sort of bargain with God or source about wanting to change what had happened. And I feel like that is something anybody who has dealt with a personal loss goes through, not being able to accept what has happened. What did you do to actually stop blaming yourself and accept it?
I think when I discovered that it was actually the contract that I had, the unspoken contract I had inside of me. I realized that I had set up an expectation in my mind, the expectation to be there for them, the expectation to be the so called rescuer or relief provider or caretaker of the family. That I felt that I was letting my father down because he would have wanted me to do this, or he would have entrusted me with this activity. And I canceled those contracts. My sister asked me a pertinent question. She asked me, when was the last time that your father asked you to step in and look into something like that? And I had to travel down my lifetime and think, oh, maybe it was 10 years, 15 years ago. And she says, do you realize it's not your present reality, but you're making it your present reality? So I
Hmm.
think talking about this, step
Hmm.
one was the fact that I realized this is what was hurting me. And it emerged in conversation with people that I felt safe with. So I think what was very important was talking about this is what's worrying me, not shutting myself away with my grief. I chose to
Hmm.
speak about things, and in that conversation, it dawned on me that this is what was bothering me. And then it dawned on me that I don't need it. This contract has reached its expiry date. It's not valid, but it still seems to be valid in my mind. And so I had to choose to cancel it and say that there is a larger force taking care of all of these things. And my brother is perfectly equipped to deal with this situation very, very effectively. And maybe I need to be more accepting of that. And maybe this is
Hmm.
going to, in some way, help them deal with his passing in a more effective way, perhaps. So it took a lot of faith in something larger than me to arrive at that acceptance and to cancel the contract that I thought I owed my father.
Thank you so much, Susie, for letting us into your grief. And I'm sure whoever is dealing with such a loss or grief in their life, they will be able to gather some strength from this and know that you're not alone. We will see you soon.